On the 15th of April, 2026, inside a White House briefing room, the warning was aimed at banks most people had never heard of. Two Chinese banks, banks in Hong Kong, banks in Oman and the UAE. The accusation was not that they had invaded anyone, not that they were the center of the sanctions regime, not even that they were the real target. The target was Iran. The banks were being warned because they allegedly helped Iranian oil money move through the system, through front companies, through correspondent accounts, through the quiet back rooms of global finance. Treasury evidence reportedly pointed to around $9 billion in Iranian oil payments routed in 2024 through companies clustered in Hong Kong, Oman, and the UAE. That is the part of the story that sounds technical, almost bureaucratic, but the warning had force for one reason. Every bank involved still needs access to the global financial network. It needs the ability to message other banks, settle payments, reach dollar accounts, and stay inside the club. Lose that, and you do not just lose one customer, you lose the world. That network is SWIFT, not a bank, not a vault, not the place where the money sits, something quieter than that, the instruction layer of global finance. And once you understand that, the story changes. This is not just a video about payment messages. It is about how a low-profile Belgian cooperative became one of the most powerful choke points on Earth, how governments learned to use that choke point, and why using it too often may slowly teach the rest of the world how to live without it. Start with what SWIFT is not. It is not a bank. It does not hold your money. It never touches the money at all. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a messaging network. When a bank in one country needs to pay a bank in another, SWIFT is the secure, standardized language they use to send the instruction. The money moves somewhere else. SWIFT just carries the order to move it. It is owned by the banks themselves. A cooperative headquartered in La Hope, just outside Brussels in Belgium. And it is enormous. More than 11,000 financial institutions in over 200 countries are connected to it, exchanging tens of millions of payment messages every single day. That is the simplest way to picture SWIFT, not the world's money pipe, but the world's banking switchboard, the trusted address book, and the secure mail service that almost every cross-border payment passes through. Before SWIFT, banks sent cross-border instructions by telex to a global network of teleprinters. It worked, but it was slow, it had no shared format, and it was dangerously easy to get wrong. A misread code or a faked message could move real money. By the early 1970s, the banks decided the patchwork was untenable. In 1973, a group of banks came together in Brussels and founded SWIFT as a shared cooperative. One standardized, secure, machine-readable way for every member to talk to every other member. The first message went out in 1977. Fittingly for a Belgian institution, it was sent by Prince Albert of Belgium. What made SWIFT spread was not glamour, it was trust. Once enough, banks adopted the same standard. Every new member made the network more useful until being on SWIFT stopped being an advantage and became a requirement. And here is the detail that matters for everything that follows. SWIFT was built to be neutral. It was deliberately designed as plumbing, a political cooperative owned by the industry rather than any government. That neutrality is exactly what would later be put to the test. Followed a single cross-border payment. A bank in one country needs to send money to a bank in another. The two may have no direct relationship, so the payment travels through correspondent banking. Banks hold accounts with one another, and the payment is settled by debiting one account and crediting another, sometimes through a chain of intermediary banks in between. SWIFT's job sits on top of that. It carries the instruction, a single, standardized message, addressed using the bank's SWIFT code, telling the next bank in the chain exactly what to do. The money itself never enters SWIFT. No funds are held, nothing is cleared, nothing is settled inside the network. This is the distinction the whole story turns on. SWIFT moves information, and the correspondent banks move the money. The network is being upgraded too. Banks are moving to a richer global messaging standard called ISO 20022, which carries far more structured data with each payment. But the core idea is unchanged since 1977. SWIFT is the instruction layer, and because almost every bank relies on that one instruction layer to reach the rest of the world, controlling who is allowed to use it turns out to be enormously powerful. The power comes from two facts stacked on top of each other. First, almost everyone is on SWIFT and there is no equally trusted substitute. So losing access means losing the ability to move money internationally at all. Second, the system runs overwhelmingly on a small number of currencies. As of December 2025, the US dollar accounted for roughly 58% of international payments on SWIFT, cross-border payments, excluding the ones sent within the Eurozone, and the euro for about 22%. The Chinese yuan, despite a decade of effort, sat near 2%. SWIFT is formally neutral, overseen by the National Bank of Belgium, together with the central banks of the G10, including the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. But because the money it carries is mostly dollars and euros, the countries that issue those currencies hold real leverage over who gets to participate. That is what turns a quiet cooperative into a choke point. It is why a warning like the one from April 2026 lands so hard. A bank that loses dollar access through the correspondent system and loses its place on the network everyone else uses is not inconvenienced. It is cut off from the global economy. For most of its life, SWIFT did exactly what it promised: stay out of politics. Then twice, it didn't. The first time was Iran. In March 2012, under European Union sanctions, SWIFT disconnected Iranian banks. The first time the network had been used as an instrument of statecraft. When sanctions were eased, the banks were reconnected in 2016. The second time was far larger. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on March 1, 2022, the EU, UK, Canada and US agreed to remove 7 Russian banks from SWIFT. Notably, 2 of the largest, Sberbank and Gazprombank, were initially spared because Europe still needed them to pay for Russian energy. As the war continued, the line moved. Sberbank was removed in June 2022, and in November 2024, the United States hit Gazprombank directly. The pattern is the same each time. Cutting a bank off is brutally effective, but every disconnection also broadcasts a message to every government watching. This network is not neutral plumbing after all. It is infrastructure with a political switch attached. And by April 2026, that logic had reached a more indirect form. Banks pressured not for what they did, but for whom they helped, knowing they could not afford to lose access. The strongest counter-argument is not that the weapon is weak, it is that there is nowhere to run. Russia is the test case. Under the most extreme financial pressure ever applied to a major economy, it could not build a real replacement. Its homegrown alternative, SPFS, launched back in 2017, but it stayed small and largely domestic, used mainly inside Russia and by a handful of partner countries, and never close to SWIFT's reach. China's network, CIPS, is the more serious challenger, and it is growing fast. By mid-2025, it linked around 176 direct and over 1,500 indirect participants across roughly 120 countries, and its 2024 transaction volume jumped more than 40%, but it is still a fraction of SWIFT's scale, and tellingly, it still routes more than 80% of its own transactions over SWIFT messaging. It ultimately leans on the same correspondent relationships and the same dollar system it is meant to escape. The hard data backs the skeptics. The dollar's share of SWIFT payments is rising, not falling, and the yuan's share has stayed flat to lower despite years of pushing. So the honest reading is narrow. SWIFT is being replaced is, for now, overstated. What is well supported is quieter. Every time the choke point is used, it gives the rest of the world one more reason to start building around it. The mistake is to imagine SWIFT as a pipe full of money. It is not. SWIFT does not hold the money, clear the money, or settle the money. It carries the instruction. It is the trusted language banks use when one side of the world needs to pay the other. And because nearly everyone still speaks that language, access to SWIFT has become a form of power. Our view is simple. This weapon works. That is the uncomfortable part. When a bank is cut off, the damage is immediate. When a country is cut off, the message is even larger. Iran learned that. Russia learned that. And the April 2026 warnings around Iranian oil payments show the same pressure in a more indirect form. You may not be the target, but if you help the target, you can still be threatened with losing access to the system. That is why SWIFT matters. Not because it is dramatic, because it is ordinary. It sits underneath the normal movement of money, which makes the threat of exclusion so powerful. But there is a cost to using infrastructure this way. Every time access to SWIFT becomes leverage, the rest of the world sees the system a little differently. It stops looking like neutral plumbing. It starts looking like plumbing with a switch on the wall. That does not mean the dollar system is collapsing. It is not. It does not mean China's CIPS or Russia's SPFS are ready to replace SWIFT. They are not. The alternatives are smaller, messier, less trusted, and often still depend on SWIFT themselves. So the real story is not SWIFT is finished. That is too neat. The real story is that SWIFT remains powerful precisely because it is so hard to avoid. But each time that power is used, it gives rival governments one more reason to build around it. The weapon is strong today. The cost is that everyone can now see the trigger. 3 plausible versions of the next decade. They are not mutually exclusive. The real future is most likely a blend. 1. Continued primacy. Sanctions stay targeted, the alternatives stay marginal, and the dollar's grip holds. Its SWIFT share is already near 58% and rising. The choke point keeps working because there is still nowhere else to go. This is the path of least resistance. 2. Parallel rails. China's CIPS keeps compounding. It has already pulled in foreign banks as direct participants and reaches roughly 120 countries, and a block of states that fear the trigger route a growing share of their trade through non-Western systems and local currencies. SWIFT stays dominant, but for a widening minority it becomes one option among several rather than the only one. 3. A technological leap. Central bank digital currencies and cross-border settlement experiments mature, to the point where some payments bypass correspondent banking, and therefore SWIFT, entirely. If that happens at scale, the messaging choke point simply matters less. The most likely outcome is not a clean break, but a slow drift. SWIFT remains the backbone of global finance, while a parallel, politically hedged plumbing grows quietly beside it, built, in part, by the very pressure meant to enforce the old system. Go back to the April warning. At first glance, it looked like a narrow sanctions story. Iranian oil, a few banks, some front companies, another line in the long argument between Washington and Tehran. But under that story was the real one. Those banks were not frightened because of a press conference. They were frightened because they live inside a system they cannot easily leave. They need correspondent accounts. They need dollar access. They need other banks to trust their messages. They need SWIFT. That is the strange power of the network. It does not have to move the money to control the movement of money. It only has to be the place everyone uses to say what should move, where, and to whom. For now, that makes SWIFT one of the strongest choke points in global finance. But choke points have a habit of changing behavior. If you control the passage, people will use it. If you close the passage, people will remember, and if you close it enough times, someone will start digging another route. The weapon is strong today. The cost is that everyone can now see the trigger.